So it is the time to start our panel discussion. We'll start the discussion, and the main topic of our panel, it is Ringelblum Archive. As we know, perhaps, the archive was founded in late autumn 1940 and existed till the January 43. So this history of the archive is quite short. In Poland, we just finished edition of the archive, and archive is composed from 38 big volumes. It is really a lot of material they were able to collect in this 2-year existence. And what I have to add is that also we are just starting edition in English, and we edited 4 volumes, and we are working for more, so more people will have the access to the archive and will be able to make the real study on it, as it was made by Samuel Kassow. He is the author of the first book, a very important book on Ringelblum Archive. All these documents are kept in our institute, and it is the greater treasure we have in our institute. I have to add that the institute, which exists around 76 years now, it is the oldest institute in the world making the research and studies on the Shoah, or we could call Holocaust, in not only in Poland but also in the Central and Eastern Europe, and we are, in our opinion, the work on the Ringelblum Archive is the top priority. It is of a greater importance for us. We are just starting our panel with the keynote lecture prepared by Professor Omer Bartov. Professor Omer Bartov, his last book on Buchach, the city, in the very small city in the so-called Galicia, in the southern eastern part of the pre-war Poland. Behind of me, as you see, is the map of Galicia. So the study on the Buchach was just translated, and it is quite important, and this book exists in Poland. One of the reasons why this book is important, not so important from the general point of view of the book, is the fact that Emanuel Ringelblum, the founder of the archive, was born in Buchach, and he spent his first years in Buchach with his family, and understand that the rest of the family of Emanuel Ringelblum perished just in Buchach. I have to add that the Professor Bartov is known not only by his, of course, by his book on Buchach, but also by his works on the representation of the Holocaust in the cinema, and also on how to say, coexistence of different national groups in the Eastern Europe. One of the books edited in 2013 is named German, Habsburg, Russian, and Ottoman Borderlands. Another, edited in 2020, is The Voices on War and Genocide, 3 accounts of the World War in Galician Town. I'm great admirer of one of his, top essays on history of the Holocaust. The essay I mentioned was published in 2008 in the Journal of Modern History, called Eastern Europe as the Site of Genocide. And in my opinion, it is really kind of the revolutionary essay, which is showing that historian can't understand the Holocaust without taking into account the role of the neighbors, not only Germans, but also Ukrainians, Poles, and other nations which were living close to the Jewish houses, Jewish homes. But also he's stressing one point which is very important for me, that the history of the Holocaust should be written not only on the basis of the German documents, but the writing of the history should take into account the documents, memoirs, diaries, written by neighbors, by witnesses of the genocide. Of course, it's not the place to discuss this essay. It will take much more time. It needs much more time. But I think that the Professor Bartov will have enough time and enough possibility to present his point of view, not only on Buchach, but also on the way the history of the Shoah should be produced, and how he thinks that this history should be made, should be written. So now it is the time for keynote speaker for Professor Omer Bartov.
Thank you very much, Professor Spivak, for this kind introduction, and thank you everyone who is listening. I cannot see anyone, of course, but I hope that some people are actually logged on to this strange new medium. What I will try to talk about today in the next 40 minutes or so is about writing genocide from below, what I call rewriting the Holocaust as first-person history. And I'll try to talk about the following topics. First, about the question of writing history from below. Obviously, I won't have a great deal of time to talk about any of those, but I'll try to give you a gist of my thinking. So the first will be writing history from below. The second would be the topic of writing a local history of the Holocaust. The third will be about writing the history of the Holocaust as first-person history, which, as I'll show, is related to the previous topic. And then I'll finally try to consider the major benefits of rewriting the Holocaust in this manner. What do we gain from this kind of methodology? So I'll start with some of my very early research. In the 1980s, when I was writing my PhD, my dissertation, I became interested in a particular question, which had to do with the manner in which the German army, the Wehrmacht, fought on the Eastern Front. That is the Great War between Germany, Nazi Germany, and Soviet Russia. As you may know, at the time, the major historical convention was that the German army, the fighting troops, the combat units of the German army, were fighting a clean war. It was still considered to have been generally a good war in the sense that Germany was acting as the bulwark against Bolshevism. While behind its back, the SS and other agencies of the Nazi regime were committing crimes which were not known or only partly known by the combat troops at the front. I came to question that widespread assumption, which was particularly popular in Germany. There was a reason why it was popular in Germany at the time, which had to do with the fact that, as you know, the German armed forces were huge. There were about 20 million men and some women who circulated through the Wehrmacht during World War II, whereas, large as they were, the other agencies of the regime were much smaller. And so in that sense, the German armed forces represented German society. And while by the early 1980s, there was widespread acceptance in Germany that the Holocaust was indeed perpetrated by Germany and Germany bore responsibility for it, it was very hard to think of the Wehrmacht, the armed forces, as having been involved in crimes. So I asked myself, how can one understand what happened at the front in a war in which there were hundreds of divisions, millions of soldiers fighting? And my choice was to take a number of combat divisions, a small number of divisions that I tried to show were representative of the army, and to see what happened there. Now, this was part of a general sort of methodology that began being common at the time of a history from below, Geschichte von unten. But it had not been done in this case, and it was usually done on a regional rather than organizational perspective. Looking at these three army divisions that I chose, and I won't get into all the details of that, of course, I came up with certain findings that I thought were important. I could show the effects of indoctrination on these soldiers. These were young men who were raised in Germany in the 1930s, who were indoctrinated already in school, in the Hitler Youth and so forth, and then were indoctrinated in the army. So the effect of the indoctrination on them, the effects of the discipline in the military, which was very harsh and quite brutal, the effect of conditions at the front, which were horrendous, and the very quick circulation of manpower through these units due to casualties, and the combined effect of these factors on what I call the distorted sense of reality among the soldiers, what they believed they were doing and what they believed they were seeing, and how that filtered into the widespread crimes carried out by combat units, by combat soldiers at the front. Now, this was part of a larger historiography that was trying to revise our understanding of the role of the German military at the time, but most of the other important studies were from above, were studies about prisoners of war, about planning of indoctrination by the higher levels of the German army. And my study looked below because I was particularly interested in seeing whether that myth that had been widespread and had been disseminated by veterans of the army and by many of the famous generals of the Wehrmacht, that they knew nothing about it. And as it turned out, not only did they know a great deal about the crimes committed by their own soldiers, they actually often ordered them to be carried out. They were directly responsible for that. Now, this was part of a reawakening in Germany of facing up to the mass complicity of German soldiers and therefore of German society in crimes carried out in the war. And the argument was that the Wehrmacht was actually a criminal organization. This was an argument that was floated already in Nuremberg in 1945, but was never really accepted by German society. And it remained, and in many ways remains until today, a controversial argument in Germany. There was a big controversy in Germany in the mid to late 1990s about an exhibition called the Wehrmachtsausstellung, the Wehrmacht exhibition about crimes of the Wehrmacht that was seen by about 1 million Germans and Austrians, quite a number of them still surviving veterans of that war, who found it very difficult to face documents and hundreds of photographs showing the complicity of regular army fighting soldiers in crimes committed by the army. So for me, this was a sort of first introduction to what one can do when carrying out a local study. It was local in the sense of choosing certain army units. Now, years passed. I did all kind of other work that I won't get into here. But in the 1990s, I became increasingly interested in another question, or I would say another, if we can say, cliche about the Holocaust. I should say that the first studies that I did about the Wehrmacht, there were a couple of books on that, were not directly on the Holocaust. Clearly, the German army was involved in massive crimes. Clearly, these crimes involved also Jews, but most of the victims of the German armed forces, which ran up to between 20 and 30 million Soviet citizens, were not against Jews, but were against German prisoners of war and Soviet civilians, including Jews. By the 1990s, as you may know, the Holocaust came to be recognized as a major event in World War II and in 20th century history. This was not the case in the past. In the 1950s, 60s, 70s, the Holocaust was not seen as a major event, neither in German historiography and nor in the historiography of World War II, nor in the historiography of the 20th century. So it took a long time for the Holocaust to be seen as a major event, which would seem to younger people today rather strange. But if you go and look at books written about World War II, even in the 1980s, and you look for in the index for terms such as Judenvernichtung, extermination of the Jews, Auschwitz, and so forth, you won't find them in the index. But by the 1990s, this had changed. And there was a growing historiography of the Holocaust. There was more and more engagement with that event by historians, and it also seeped into politics. So there was more recognition by different states. European states, in the United States, the creation of the Holocaust Memorial Museum, of the importance of that event. But there was a certain understanding of what the Holocaust was. And I became increasingly uncomfortable with that understanding. The way people spoke about the Holocaust, and I myself had used that term in a subtitle of one of my books, was to think of it as an event of industrial killing. Industrial killing in the sense that Jews were collected in one place in Europe, put on trains, taken to extermination camps, and in those camps, within a brief period of time, a couple of hours, they were gassed, then their bodies were cremated, or they were put into mass graves. That meant that in this kind of understanding of the Holocaust, there was a minimal contact between the perpetrators and the victims. Now, it is, of course, true that about half of the victims of the Holocaust did die in that way, although it does not mean that they didn't have other relationships with the perpetrators before all of that happened. But the other half of the victims were not killed that way. And as I began thinking about it and reading about it, I realized that vast numbers of Jews in Eastern Europe, where most of the Jews had lived and most of them were murdered, most of them, about half of them, were killed where they lived. And I wanted to understand how that actually happened. What were the dynamics of this kind of a local genocide within the framework of a larger continent-wide genocide? Considering that all these local killings, all these local events, when put together, made up a very large share of the Holocaust as a whole. I was interested in that in the 1990s also because you may recall that immediately following the fall of the communist regime in the Soviet Union and the disintegration of communism throughout Eastern Europe, we were told that a new world was opening up and now history was over. And that was immediately followed by two genocides. One in Southeastern Europe, in the former Yugoslavia, in 1992. It began in 1992. And another in Rwanda in Africa in 1994. And what distinguished those cases of mass killings was that they were killings of neighbors on neighbors. And so that too was something that was in the back of my mind as I tried to rethink the historiography of the time of the Holocaust. So in order to do that, I went back to the notion of a local history, but this time choosing a particular locality. And the locality that I chose, as Professor Spevak just said, was the town of Buchach. I had some reasons to choose the town of Buchach. Of course, as we know, Emanuel Ringelblum came from Buchach. Shimon Wiesenthal, the so-called Nazi hunter, came from Buchach. I knew it particularly because Shmuel Yosef Agnon, I would say the greatest writer in the Hebrew language and the only Hebrew language author to have received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1966, not only came from Buchach, but devoted much of his writings, his voluminous writings, to Buchach. And his final book, which was published posthumously, was a kind of biography of his town. So I knew about that town and was curious to know more about it. And since it was quite representative of small towns, small Jewish, as they were seen by Jews, small Jewish towns in Eastern Europe, I thought I might as well choose it. As I will mention later on, it was also my mother's hometown, and that also played into that choice. So I chose the town of Buchach in order to conduct this local study and to understand the nature of the encounter between the perpetrators and the victims. In the historiography of the time, there was very little of that. There was very little about the encounter. The image we had of the Holocaust was more the kind of image of a Nazi perpetrator sitting on his horse, looking from the top of a hill at the camp as the Jews are running to the gas chambers. There is no real meeting between them. And I asked myself, well, that may have happened in Sobibor, in Treblinka, but what happened in those towns? In the course of studying Buchach, I realized that this question was not sufficient. It was not sufficient because apart from the encounter between the victims and the perpetrators, there were other people living in such towns as Buchach. In fact, half of the population of Buchach at the time of the war were not Jews. Although in Jewish memory, Jews speak about having come from a shtetl. The shtetl is a figment of the Jewish literary imagination. These towns were mixed. Most Jews saw them as a Jewish town. The Poles who lived them saw them as Polish towns. The Ukrainians who lived in them saw them as Ukrainian towns. And if you go to other parts of the world, of that area of Eastern Europe, North Galicia, then there would have been Lithuanians or Belarusians and so forth. And so I realized that this was actually not a relationship of perpetrators and victims, but a triangular relationship between the Jews, their neighbors, their Christian neighbors, and then the Germans who arrive on the scene. It also became increasingly clear to me that we could not actually begin at the end. Like many others, I'm sure many of you, I was greatly influenced by the very influential and important book by Jan Tomasz Gross, Neighbors. And I'm very well aware also of its effect on Poland at the time that it came out. And I won't get into all of that now, we can talk about it later. But one thing that I thought was needed was not to begin when the killing begins, but to go back in time. And I thought that was important because of that triangular relationship. Because when the Germans arrived on the scene, there were already relations between, in a town like Buchach, between the Jews, the Poles, and the Ukrainians. And those relationships between the different religious ethnic groups mattered a great deal in the manner in which the genocide was carried out. This is not to say that the Germans would not have tried to kill all the Jews in any case, and they did under very different circumstances in different places. But it does mean that the way things worked out in those places and the way they are remembered until today had to do with the relations between those groups. Now, I will move for a moment now to writing this case as a first-person history. So in writing the events as they happen in one town over time, and then zooming into the events as they transpired during the Holocaust itself, what I tried to do was to write it as much as I could through the voices of the people who were there. This is not to say that I was not using also as much official documentation as I could, which I believe as an empirical historian we should do. But it is to say that I never believed, and believed less and less, that you can write the history of genocide, any genocide, or the Holocaust, or in fact, any event in history, only from one perspective. And the perspective that is reflected in the official documents, particularly when these are documents written by the perpetrators, is skewed. It's skewed just because it's their point of view. And because I was trying, in a sense, to write the history of the town from within, I tried to find as many voices as I could of the people who were there. And indeed, I found many. One reason that my study of Buchach took so long is that it turned out that a small town that had a population of about 15,000 people in 1939 had left behind a huge amount of documentation. Briefly, I had over 250 personal accounts of different types by Jews from that town, and several scores of accounts by Poles and Ukrainians, as well as numerous accounts given in trials carried out by the Soviets, by the Poles, by the East Germans, and particularly by West Germans. Thousands and thousands of pages of such accounts. So it meant that in trying to tell the Holocaust through the eyes of the protagonists, of the Jews, the neighbors, the Poles and the Ukrainians, and the perpetrators, a different picture of the event was emerging. And here I should add that because my mother also came from that town, and because I talked with my mother about her childhood, growing up in that town, and I did that many years after my own childhood. I spoke with her when I was already in my 40s, and I was fortunate to do it at the time because shortly thereafter she passed away. I had also a sense of intimacy with that place that I might not have had had I not had that personal connection to it. And so the writing of the history of the place as a first-person history was both listening to how people talked about those events at different times through different means, including conversations that I had with many people, but also the sense that under different circumstances, I too might have been there. And that my mother, who left Buchach in 1935, had she stayed just a few more years, would have also undergone these sort of horrific events that occurred there during the German occupation. So in the time that remains, I want to speak with you a little bit about the major benefits of writing this. If you want to get the sort of long story of Buchach, you can obviously read the book. It's now available in Polish and in English, and I'm glad to say that it's coming out very shortly also in German and in French, And those of you who read Hebrew, I was very pleased to see that it came out in Hebrew too. And I was engaged in that exercise, of course, because Hebrew is my own first language. So some of the major benefits of doing this kind of history in rethinking our understanding of the Holocaust. And why I thought this long-term investment of time by me was worth it, or at least in retrospect, I think it was. So the first thing that it shows us is that the Holocaust was only in part a case of industrial killing. That in fact, about half of the Jewish victims were killed where they lived. They were killed in their own synagogues, they were killed in nearby parks and creeks, on the street, in their own homes. That's important to understand, because the historiography of the Holocaust was written not only mostly from the top, but was written also mostly from the center, from the point of view of Germany and of the West. And that perspective means that it is also seen as a case in which people were deported from their own neighborhoods, were taken to the local train station and disappeared in the east. They were sent nach Osten, to the east. And what happened in the east was not really discussed much. It was just known that they were killed. Whereas in fact, as you see when you look at each and every town of those hundreds of towns throughout this vast swath of territory, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, to the Balkans, you find that in all those towns, large numbers of people were killed where they lived and are still buried there in mass graves, very often unmarked mass graves. So in that sense, the nature of what happened is more similar to the kind of genocides that occurred in the 1990s than to the view that we have of the Holocaust as a case of industrial killing, of mechanized industrial killing, where millions of people are killed in factories which produce not goods, but corpses. Secondly, it shows that another sort of cliche that we had about the Holocaust and was widely debated in Germany in the 70s, 80s, 90s, about who knew what happened and how secret was it, is also simply untrue. That is, it shows that the killing of large numbers of people was neither secret nor anonymous. Instead, it was public and it was intimate. It was public in the sense that people were gathered on the street, taken to a nearby place and shot. You could hear the shooting. You could often see it. There were many onlookers who went off to see what it looks like. People talked about it subsequently, and some people that I interviewed, many people who left accounts. So everything was very public. There was nothing secret about any of what happened. It was also intimate. It was intimate in the sense that before the killing began, and I use here the example of Buchach, but you can use it in many other instances. Before the killing began, people got to know each other. Now, of course, Jews, Ukrainians, and Poles knew each other because they had lived there together. They knew each other by name. These were small towns. Their children went to school together. They visited each other's homes. They often spoke each other's languages. And so there was an intimacy that there is in any small community. When the Germans arrived, the Germans did not start the killing, the mass killing right away. They usually killed a number of people, the so-called intelligentsia, right at the beginning. In Buchach, they killed about 450 people they associated with the intelligentsia. They did that already. They arrived in July 1941. They did that killing in August 1941. But then the killing, the mass killing, begins only in October of 1942. In that period, during that more than a year, the Germans on the ground get to know the Jews. In fact, Jews come in and out of German homes. Jews are used as cleaners, as servants, as babysitters, as tailors, as doctors, as cooks. They are known to the Germans by their names. They know the Germans themselves. There is a relationship between the two groups, so that when the killing begins, everybody knows everybody else. Obviously, as I say, the neighbors know who is being killed. They also know which apartments now are available, which goods are available, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And the Germans know who they're killing, and in fact, there are instances where Jews call out to the people about to shoot them by name and ask them to spare them, which they don't. So it is a very intimate affair. Those of you who read, say, about the genocide in Rwanda will run into such accounts too, where the people who are doing the killing and the people who are doing the dying know each other and know each other well. Thirdly, another important point and another kind of cliche of the historiography of the Holocaust is the distinction we like to make, quite naturally, between perpetrators, victims, and bystanders. We obviously don't like to think of ourselves as perpetrators. We'd rather not be victims. And so when we imagine ourselves, I think, in relationship to cases of genocide, we'd rather think of ourselves as bystanders. And the truth is that in all genocides, most of the people are neither perpetrators nor victims. They are those who, so to speak, stand by. But if you look at what happens, what are the social dynamics of genocide in any locality, you realize that there is no such thing as people standing by. What you can only say is that there are degrees of engagement. People have to make choices all the time. Do they shelter people? Do they hide them when they come and knock on their door? Do they denounce them if they don't want to keep them anymore? Do they partake of their property if they leave it behind? Do they join the local police because then they get a better salary? Do they join the killers units for one reason or another? Maybe because they don't want to be sent to fight at the front. Everyone is engaged on one level or another. So in that sense, this distinction that we'd like to make is unclear. It is also the case that people change roles, that at one point people might be victimized, and you take many towns such as Buchach. I can't go into all the details of that right now because I run out of time, but of course, between 1939 and 1941, this area is occupied by the Soviets, and people have a certain view of who victimizes whom. So at a certain point, people who are seen later on as collaborators are seen at a previous point in time as those who are victimized by them. So this entire distinction between victims, perpetrators, and bystanders begins to fall apart when you see what is happening on the local level. Another matter which is also very typical of writing on the Holocaust and writing on other genocides is that we have a predilection, again, quite natural, to try and distinguish between good and evil. It's clear that people who come to a town and start killing men, women, and children on a large scale are evil. That's an easy assertion. Who the people are who are good is a bit more difficult. And in writing this book and in thinking increasingly about it, I thought that what interested me to a large degree was this question of ambivalent or ambiguous goodness. The fact of the matter is that people could, at one point, provide shelter to those who were victimized, and at another point, denounce them. People could be actually engaged in the killing, and at another point, spare someone, maybe only one person, which for them might even be something they could not remember, but for that person meant the difference between life and death. So this distinction that we try to make between good and evil, between the altruistic and between the killers, begins to fall apart. I don't believe that I need to refer this audience to Primo Levi's famous essay, The Gray Zone, which is maybe the most important essay on this topic of ambivalence of goodness. But I would say that since his experience was in Auschwitz, and what I examined was what he did not know because he did not experience, what happens in a small town, you see in a small town how ambivalent things are. I should say most of the people, most of the Jews who survived in such towns as Buchach survived because they were helped by neighbors. It was almost impossible to survive without help from your neighbors. Large numbers of people who were killed, especially in the latter part, after the mass killing is over, when people are hiding, were killed because they were denounced by neighbors or by others who were not neighbors, but living nearby. And so this makes the whole story a much more complicated story, and I think tells us much more about ourselves and our own lives and neighborhoods and what we could expect under conditions of extreme rule, extreme policies. So in that sense, I would say that survival depended on others, whereas dying often was due to denunciation. Another point that is very important to point out is that the killing of so many people in remote places where German security forces were extremely thin on the ground could not have been carried out so effectively and so quickly without massive collaboration by locals. In the case of Buchach and Chortkov, the nearby town, and they were in the same region, in the town of Chortkov, or Chortkiv now, there was a security police outpost. It numbered about 20 men. Most of them were German, some were ethnic German from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and so forth, Lithuania. Those 20 men, between summer 1942 and summer 1943, murdered about 60,000 Jews. It would have been impossible for such a small number of men to round up people living in towns and villages throughout this area and to kill them in such a brief period of time. They accomplished this because they had a much larger contingent of auxiliary policemen who were recruited from the local Ukrainian population. They had local police, some German gendarmes, Ukrainian police and Jewish police in all the little towns that facilitated the rounding up of the population and bringing them either to the train station, from which they were deported to Berzhets in the early part of the genocide, that is in late summer 1942, and then throughout 1943, in the first half of 1943, taking them to killing sites around these towns themselves. Next, it's important when you look at the perpetrators, and this obviously interested me already because of my early work on the Wehrmacht, where I did try to show that ideological indoctrination played a major role. It's important to say that for those men, those few members of the security police, some were SS, some were Kriminalpolizei, some were Gestapo, those men did not show, and in subsequent interrogations of those who were interrogated, did not concede that they had any difficulties at all in carrying out, in being motivated to carry out those killings. They don't really talk much about ideological motivation. They had no trouble finding the shooters. There was no problem in finding the people who would actually, once Jews were rounded up and put in front of pits into which they were shot, to find the people who would do the shooting. What they do recall in many of the interrogations is that the time they had in this bucolic area of Buchach and Chortkov was the best time of their lives. What you find, disturbingly, is that those men and women, because they brought, since they were comfortable, they were under no threat from anyone, they brought their wives, they brought their mistresses, they brought their children, they sometimes brought their parents. They lived in great comfort. They had unlimited access to food, to alcohol, to tobacco. There was a tobacco factory nearby. And of course, they had absolute control over life and death, absolute power. They could do whatever they liked. They also had total access to sex. And there was no control over who they were having sex with, whether they were Jews or locals. And so it's when you look at the genocide from below, from this perspective, you realize the extent to which this was experienced as a particularly good time by the people who were carrying it out, and how they remembered it maybe 20 years later when they were interrogated by the West German police. A few final points. I think that a study like this, a study of personal accounts of a history from below, of a first-person history, shows us that when we use personal accounts, with all the problematic aspects of this that we can talk about, it helps us see events that would otherwise, first of all, it helps us see events from within in a very different way from how they are depicted or described in official accounts, for obvious reasons. It also helps us uncover events that don't appear at all in official documentation. And I'll give just one example. In March 1944, the town of Buchach and surrounding villages is liberated or taken over by the Red Army. But in April, the Red Army makes a tactical retreat from that area, and the Germans come back. And they rule this area until July 1944. So between April and July 1944, the Germans are back. By then, most of the Jews have been murdered, and German rule is disintegrating. The Gestapo is gone, the security police is gone. It's too dangerous for them to stay there. They don't like it when there's shooting. During that period, there are thousands of Jews who are hiding in the area. I should say that in Buchach in March 1944, when the Red Army arrives, about 800 Jews come out of shelter, of hiding in villages, in bunkers. When the Germans come back, almost all of them are killed. So that by the time Buchach is liberated for the second time in July 1944, less than 100 people, less than 100 Jews are still alive. But in the area, there are large numbers of Jews who are hiding in the forests, in villages, in barns, and anywhere, and in some labor camps that are still being used by the Germans. Most of the violence against Jews in that area is by locals, because the only Germans on the ground by then are using Jews as labor forces. They're not interested in killing them. But there is a great deal of violence in this chaotic period of time. But there is one German officer who arrives in a nearby town called Tovtzen. And he apparently comes from the east. We don't know his name. His unit must have retreated with the rest of the German forces from the east. And he is appalled by this killing by locals of Jews in the forest and in labor camps. And he tells the Jews in this town that he would protect them until the Red Army arrives. And by July 1944, when the Red Army comes back, there are about 600 Jews who have heard this rumor that spreads through the forest and who come to this town to be protected by this German officer. Now, we would not know about this event at all had it not been for Jewish testimonies. We have no information about the officer himself, not even his name. We only know about it from testimonies by Jews who survived thanks to him. And we know about him only thanks to those testimonies by those he saved. A couple of other final points. I would say that when you try to do what I did, which was not only to look at one group, I tried to understand the Germans, the Poles, the Ukrainians, and the Jews in this town. When you read accounts by Poles and Ukrainians, you realize that the genocide of the Jews was not their main concern. The Germans were interested, of course, in killing the Jews because this was their task there, those who were tasked with it. The rest of the local population was not particularly interested in that, increasingly because there is growing violence between Poles and Ukrainians. And by early 1944, a wave of mass killing by Ukrainian forces, by the Ukrainian insurgent army and members of the OUN, of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, begin a massive ethnic cleansing operation of that area, which is independent entirely of German policies in the region. And so there is not that much focus on what is happening or what had happened to the Jews. However, on one level there is, and that is the level of property. When you look at what happens in such places as Buchach, and accounts, not just by Jews, but by Poles and Ukrainians, the emptying of such towns as Buchach of the Jewish population means that people in the town and from surrounding villages move in and take over their property. And it means that there is a motivation in how people in poor areas behave that has to do with property. Indeed, I would say that what we find from such studies is that not only is property a major element, but in fact that most people profit from genocide. People end up with real estate, with other goods, which they otherwise would not have had because the population that had them has been killed. They also move into positions, professions, which were not available before. And that has to do later on with how people will talk about those events, how they will remember them, and what they will deny about them and try to forget because of the profit they made from these events, from the removal of a certain population from the area. When you look at the case of the perpetrators, I used a great deal, of course, of, as I said, of judicial information, particularly from German courts. Those are voluminous. The German system produces, the German legal system produces a great deal of documentation. And so this is extremely good for the historian. And one is very thankful for that system because of that. But there's a jarring contradiction between the fantastic collection of documentation and the justice of the system. That is that at the end, it turns out, as we know about many other genocides, that most people get away with genocide. That is that altogether, most of the people who were involved in the killing in such places as Buchach did not go to jail. Most of them were not even interrogated, but those who were usually were sent home. And the last thing I want to say is that what you find when you do such a close study of one place and you take it over time from long before the genocide began until after that, and you speak and read what people say years thereafter, you realize that the same sort of segregated view of those places that existed before, and that in many ways led to the way people behaved during the time, remains afterwards, that we still have communities of memory. They may be exiled, they may have built up new lives elsewhere, but they still view and remember those events, not only they, but several generations thereafter, through these very different segregated perspectives. So I will stop here, and I hope very much that we can have a discussion now. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I was listening so carefully, so I was not able to answer immediately. Thank you very much. It was very good, fantastic lecture. You know that you are a great lecturer, so you know that this compliment are real, but you know that you are making, perhaps, so far as I understand, fantastic job as a professor of university. Now it is the time for the discussion. I got only one question, but I understand that other question could be presented by others. It is the question put by Małgorzata Pakier. Dr. Małgorzata Pakier, she is one of the organizers of the conference. And the question is, I will read it slowly. Thank you so much for this most interesting lecture and for your work. And the question is, what is the universal lesson from the Holocaust based on local, grounded research of the past, as you have done on Buchach? Thank you.
Thank you. That's that's a pretty big question. So let me say two things. First, I've always been skeptical about drawing too many lessons from atrocity. You know, I come from Israel, and in a country like Israel, there has always been an attempt to draw certain lessons from the Holocaust. And I'm a little skeptical about the idea that you begin drawing lessons about humanity, about tolerance, about relations between people, that you start off with atrocity, with mass killing. So in general, I've written a little bit about this. I've been skeptical about the whole notion of drawing lessons. We can learn, of course, we have to learn from history. That's why we do history. But some of the lessons that I drew from this case, as you've seen, is, for instance, that, it's not only the case of the Holocaust, most people get away with it. If you kill one person, you can expect to end up in jail. If you kill 1 million people, you may go home. So that's I'm skeptical about that. However, in the case of, as you asked, of the local genocide, I think there is a certain lesson, and I've been thinking more about it in the last few years, actually, not when I started. And that is that how easy it is when you live in a certain community, a town, a village, a neighborhood, where people lived side by side. In the case of Buchach, Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews lived side by side for about 4 centuries. Not a harmonious relationship necessarily, but the only one they knew. This was the only reality of their lives. As I said, they interacted all the time. They often spoke each other's languages. I've still met a number of elderly Ukrainians who have a smattering of Yiddish because they learned it at the time. And my grandfather and grandmother and mother spoke Polish, Ukrainian, Yiddish. People lived side by side. And as I say, although there were prejudices, there were all kind of opinions, it was not a pluralistic, tolerant society, but it was the way people lived. How easy it is under certain circumstances for this sort of crust of normality, of civic relations, of neighborhoods, of friendships to break. And once, once it breaks, everything goes loose. And how easy it is for violence to break out. Now, why are the reasons for that, or what can we learn from that? In those cases that in the case of Buchach, and it's of course not only Buchach, clearly the deterioration begins with the rise of a particular kind of nationalism in the second part of the 19th century, an ethnic and territorial nationalism that is about who belongs and who does not belong. And that filters through every town, every community. It has to do also with a growing sense that my neighbor's profit comes at a price to me. So there's a growing politics and mentality of resentment against other groups. And at a certain point, when you find that this kind of tension, national tension, social resentment, then encounters mass violence in all of that region, World War I plays a huge role. In World War I, life becomes cheap. In World War I, you see Jewish communities being subjected to violence by Russian occupying forces, and the population can watch that and see that life itself becomes cheap. Once that kind of exposure to violence is married to prior resentment and prior assertions that what is mine is not yours, what serves you hurts me, then the moment of a break in that crust of relations comes close. And finally, when one group, and I think this is the world that we live in now, when one group, whatever it might be, it could have been Jews there, it could be immigrants, it could be exiles, it could be refugees, it could be people across the border, when one group is presented to the public as dangerous, as insidious, as undermining the social order, as looking different, as endangering our way of life, our tradition, as dressing differently, as praying differently. Once that becomes part of a general public discourse, once it becomes, as the Germans called it, salonfähig, once you can talk about it in polite company, then you can expect that to come to your neighborhood. And there's one sort of model that I've had for myself because of what I was doing in Buchach. It's this notion that one day you are living in a neighborhood, you know your neighbors, and you hear late at night, you hear some noise on the street, you're afraid that there may be a burglary or something's going on, and you're a good citizen, so you call the police and you tell the police, hey, there's something going on. The police arrive, they knock on your door, and they arrest you. And once that happens, you realize that the forces of order, the forces that you are supposed to trust, the law and its enforcers, are still operating as they did before, only now they're targeting you. And for the rest of your neighborhood, that's fine. The police came and did what it was supposed to do, and you are no longer part of that kind of human solidarity. You have been outed. I talked about it once in a college in New York, in Brooklyn, and many of the students who were there were minorities, were Black, were immigrants from Muslim countries. And they sort of looked at me and half smiled because that was their experience. That was their experience, and now where they live. That if you call the police, they may come and arrest you. And so I think this is a lesson that we certainly should take to heart.
every minute. So, and we have only 10 minutes for the rest of the discussion. So I will start with from the question put by Josephine Hanke from the University of Constance. Thank you very much for your insightful presentation. And now is the question, in how far can your methodology be applied to other contexts, and what difficulties did you experience when applying it to your case study? Is it
Well, thank you.
Clear?
Yes, yes. Thank you. You know, that's also a big question. So it has two parts. One is how applicable is this to other cases, and the second, how difficult it is. So let me start with the second, how difficult this is. So it's difficult. So it's like what Clausewitz said about war. You know, in war everything is easy, and the easiest thing is very difficult. And so it's easy in the sense that what you need to do, the way at least I did it, I had a kind of my goal was to collect all the documents I could on this one place. And that was actually what I did in my dissertation many years ago when I was writing about the 3 German army divisions. I collected all the documentation I could find on them, everything. So it's a kind of total history of one place, or earlier of one unit. Now, I did not expect to find as much as I did, but I found a huge amount of material. It took a lot of time. I was helped by some intrepid research assistants who really helped me a great deal in finding materials in 9 countries, in about, I think altogether about 50 archives, and then hundreds of first-person accounts. So obviously, this takes a long time if you have this kind of conceit of writing a total history. Then, of course, you end up with too much material, and you cannot really accommodate it in one book. So you have to make very painful editorial decisions. A lot of the material falls on the cutting board. So that too is difficult, because it's you have to give up a lot of what you have, and you have to decide what is the most important. But it is not difficult in the sense that the material exists. There was a kind of idea that we can't do this because we won't find enough material, and that's simply not true. Certainly in the sense of first-person testimonies, if you take into account that we have tens of thousands of first-person accounts, many of which have never been heard or read, and they're just waiting. And I should say that part of my own motivation became increasingly to listen to the people who wrote or talked about these events, not only as we would like to say, just so that their children would know, or because they thought it was time. They often said they wanted historians to use their own accounts to write the history of what happens in their communities. And so the material exists. It's difficult to deal with. It can be emotionally very straining, certainly personal accounts. I've said before, you know, much of the accounts that I was using when I was doing that, my daughter was quite young and was at home. And so many of the accounts were by women who were then children. And the thought, when you have a child at home, of children undergoing the circumstances of mass killing all around them was sometimes too hard to bear. So it is difficult, but I think I felt that it was important to do. Can that be applied? Of course it can be applied. So first of all, it can be applied to studying the Holocaust. We would do well with more studies of what happened in localities that try to take everything into account, that try to see things as I try to do through the eyes of the different groups that were there, and then tries to reconstruct the events of the killing itself. Also, with this, I'd say, three-dimensional approach to see those events through the eyes of those who were there, the kind of Rashomon effect, and not to have the one-dimensional reconstruction of genocide through the eyes of the perpetrators alone. I think it can be applied to many, many other places, and not obviously not only the Holocaust, obviously not only genocide, but also other cases. I should say, and I say that just in passing, my current interest is actually about the history of my generation growing up in Israel, and what we sort of saw and didn't see as we were growing up. And one important aspect of this is that people growing up in Israel in the 1950s and 60s were growing up both on denying on denial of the diaspora, shlilat galut as it was called. So we were the first generation. We didn't want to know and were not told anything about the past, and denial of what had been there just before we were born, that there was a Palestinian society there that had disappeared in 1948. And we really didn't talk about it. So the way that one can use this kind of methodology is to look at events such as, say, 1948 in Israel through multiple perspectives. And the history you would then write would be a completely different history from the history that is being written and has been written in the past. So I certainly think it's possible, and I think it's important to do.
Thank you very much. I have 5 more questions, and we have 15 minutes, because the organizers gave us more time for the discussion. The question was, I will read, was put by Roma Sendyka. She will contribute to our panel later. Roma Sendyka, she's affiliated to Jagiellonian University. The question is, you propose to understand genocide as a communal event, and as such, it needs research on all possible data from all communities involved. However, in the so-called era of the witness, the bystander's testimony was largely dismissed. Shoshana Fellman claimed bystanders only project their own insight on Jewish experience and only distort the facts, merely dreaming their memory, being basically false witness. What is your experience of working with reading through against beyond bystanders' testimonies? And if you don't mind, I will read one question more. I understand the question is strictly connected with the previous one, okay? This question was put by Zofia Wójcicka, Dr. Zofia Wójcicka, and she's asking, thank you for the very clear and interesting lecture. A methodological question. How would you define the difference in dealing with witness accounts from the time and later post-war of even recent testimonies? Okay, and I have 2 or 3 questions more. I hope that we will have enough time.
Yeah, so I'll try to be relatively brief.
So we have around 10 minutes to 12 minutes.
Okay. I'll be as brief as I can. These are great questions. Thank you. So first of all, yes, I write about communal genocide. Now I should say that when I say communal genocide, I do not mean that it is only communal. So if you talk about genocides, whether you're talking about the Holocaust or you're talking about other cases of genocide, the Cambodian genocide, the Armenian genocide, Rwandan genocide, there are it does have these two levels. One is that these are events that are directed from above. There is a state or there is an organization that sets out to destroy a certain group. So this is one aspect of genocide, and it's very important to keep in mind, because while there was and there would have been violence in these communities, there was in World War I a great deal of violence in Galicia, and there would have been, and there was a great deal of violence in Galicia without the Germans. The urge of a regime, of an occupier, of an army, of an organization to uproot, to destroy a certain group is important in determining much of what happens in that communal genocide. But as I said before, the nature of how that occurs, the origins of that, and the repercussions and memories of it have to do very much also with the local circumstances. And if we look at that kind of genocide as it occurs communally and as it is carried out by the people who come there and their local collaborators, it also tells us a great deal about the genocide as a whole, which we would not know if we look at it only from the top, say from Berlin. So this is the one thing I wanted to say. Now, regarding Shoshana Feldman and Annette Viviorka and the era of the witness and false witness, look, I mean, I read all of this and discussed this with the authors, not with Shoshana Feldman, but with Annette, and I greatly respect their work. And Viviorka worked a great deal with Testimonies. My own view is somewhat different, I would say. My view is not so much, I wasn't so much looking at what is false witness and what is true witness. What is the truth and who is lying? There are difficulties, as I think we all know, of working, and that relates to the second question as well, of working with testimonies. I wrote a long article about that, so I don't want to speak too long about this, but there are difficulties of working with that, and my view was that we have to work with all the material we have. We should not dismiss anything, which is, by the way, what Jan Tomasz Gross rightfully said. We have to use everything. When we have a critical mass of testimonies, of documents, of eyewitness accounts, of court proceedings, we can try to reconstruct the event, and we can then determine which accounts are more useful to us and which are not. Some which we find are not truthful remain useful. They can reflect very much what people believe they saw or want us to think they saw, and it can tell us something about how they experienced or remembered or tell those events. I have many such examples, but it does not mean that they're not useful in reconstructing the event. There are many cases of Jewish survivors who tell stories that I can pretty certainly say are not entirely true or are only partly true. I'll give you one example of that only. A person that I interviewed in 2003, I believe, from Buchach, who told me about being in the resistance in the forest and about his relations with Ukrainians before the war, about his schooling and so forth. And some years later, I found evidence that he gave at a trial in Germany in 1968, in which he described himself as a member of the Jewish police. And so he never mentioned that to me when I spoke with him, and he never mentioned at the German trial that he was later a partisan. In each place, he talked about something else, depending on the circumstances. He wasn't lying, but he wasn't telling the entire truth. And of course, there are many cases of, say, Ukrainian testimonies that don't provide all the truth or all the facts, but they matter a great deal in reconstructing people's perceptions of the event, which I find most important. And the last thing on early and late testimony. So there is a kind of truism, or I think a somewhat mistaken belief, that the closer you are to the time, the more truthful the account you give is, because later on your account would be contaminated by the environment, by the historiography, by what you hear others say, by old age, by forgetfulness, by all of those things. And in part, of course, it's true, but in part it isn't. So for one thing, you can, and that has happened to me personally, you can talk with someone who hasn't talked about those events. And you may talk with them 40 years later. And when you speak with them, something occurs in which they are transported to that time in a way that you can tell they, for the first time, are actually articulating in words the experience that they had, which they had not done before. So it is a kind of time box that opens up, and we should never discard that. We should never make light of it. The people, the Fortinov video archive at Yale wrote about it very interestingly, and I won't go into that now. The second and last thing I'll say is that there are cases, and I had some myself, where people gave accounts or wrote accounts very early on, right after they were liberated, especially if they were very young, and then spoke about them years later. There are cases, I would say, and I saw them, where very young people, I know some cases of girls, when they spoke about what they experienced right after, could not articulate what exactly happened to them. This has, in the case that I'm thinking about now, this has to do with sexual abuse. Whereas 20, 30, 40 years later, having already built families of their own, had a life of their own, had children of their own, they can then look back and speak differently about those events, not less truthfully, but actually have more insight into the events that they had experienced as children. And so I think we, again, have to be less rigid about that, and we have to take each account for what it is and not make these rigid distinctions between one and another.
Okay, next question. Okay, we have 5 minutes. I'm very sorry, but the time is running. A question was put by Olof Bortz. Thank you very much for this fascinating lecture. Professor Bartov, my name is Olof Bortz, and I am postdoctoral research at in Paris. I have two questions. First, regarding recent German works for television dealing with the Eastern Front during World War II, my sense is that the miniseries such as Unsere Vater, Unsere Mütter and der Überläufer tends to stress local conditions in portraying the crimes committed by German soldiers against the local population. Would you argue that there is a myth surrounding the Wehrmacht, stressing local brutalization. And secondly, you mention communities of memory. Do you see the sustained focus on Jewish survivors' testimony as a missed opportunity to interview other communities as well? I hope the question is good.
Thank
for you.
Thank you. And I have 4 minutes, so I'll try to be quick. The first question is very interesting. I did watch that mini series, and I was struck by it. And I'll tell you why. When I published my early studies in the 1980s about the Wehrmacht, there were some articles that said that finally we have learned that the Wehrmacht Shield of Honor was not untainted. Finally, we've learned about that. During the Wehrmachtsausstellung debate, which happened in the late 90s, the same thing was said. The myth of the Wehrmacht has a kind of phoenix-like quality that it keeps coming back all the time. And as I said, the reason for that is that it's very hard to accept that our grandfathers, our great uncles by now, were participating in a criminal undertaking in the uniform of the Wehrmacht. And this series has, to my mind, exactly the same kind of syndrome. It reminded me of films that were made, like a film, Der Arzt from Stalingrad, which was made in the 1950s. It had exactly, and then a much more recent film made, I think, in the 80s, also on Stalingrad, or in the 90s, where you have nice, decent German men, really boys, who go out to the front, and they're often, because there's some evil SS man around or one bad guy, they have to do some things that they would not want to do, and they are brutalized by it. It is a kind of nostalgic, apologetic, and national exercise. And I was very disappointed to see that a series that was made by a young filmmaker with young actors was repeating the same tropes that you find already in the 1950s. And you can find, say, in a very early story by Heinrich Böll called Der Zug kam pünktlich, the train came on time, exactly the same kind of syndrome of the young German man who, all well-meaning, who somehow then finds himself in a really bad situation. That's not what my studies showed. On the second question of communities of memory, I certainly believe that it is important, in my own study I tried, that it is important to listen and to read and to interview other communities of memory. One has to, and I try to do it, but I'll say as the last day, because I've run out of time, that it is also true that when a community is subjected to genocide and large parts of it are murdered, it is particularly important to listen to the voices of that community, because genocide is not only about killing people, it's also about erasing their memory. And the undertaking of recovering the memory of those who were eradicated is a particularly important task. Thank you.
I would like to add one remark. I don't have the time for my question because I have a lot of questions, but for the future. I think that I have to stress the point that in Polish historiography, there is a lot of books or works just on the local history. on the Holocaust done from below. I will say about one book. It is a book prepared by the Center for the Holocaust Study, very important group, team of workers connected with the Polish Academy of Science. And they produced a book just on the Holocaust seen through the local history, in the local history. Some of these essays are really of a great importance, very detailed, and are giving us giving us information how the people during the war were participating in the Holocaust, how they reacted on the Holocaust. So I think that your work, the way you are doing your historical work, is followed by the Polish historians. So I think that your example seems to me very important. Of course, if you will go into the Polish, not only historiography, but also into the Polish novels, to the memoirs written just after the war, you will find also a lot of information about the local history. I will say from my personal history is my parents were killed in a very small city close to the city Rovne by the Ukrainian policemen. So the Holocaust in this place was done without Germans. Only Ukrainians were involved in killing the small Jewish community. Of course, we could have much more questions. Your lecture was so intensive, so gives so a lot of inspiration, as well as your book is so important for us. And thank you very much for your presence. It was a great afternoon to be with you online, but it was a great time. Thank you very much for your effort, for your work, for your presence with us. And we wish you, first of all, a lot of health, because pandemic, it is very, very dangerous. And we wish you all the best, and we'll go on with the conference for the next 2.5 hours, if you will be so good and will stay with us. It would be great. And now we'll have a 15 minutes technical break. So we'll meet in 15 minutes. It means close to the 10 minutes to 5, according to the Central European time. Thank you, very much, Professor Bartov. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll come to the next part of our panel, and now we'll listen to two presentations and two commentaries. I understand, to the lectures we'll listen to, and also to the keynote lecture given by Omer Bartov. And first, we'll listen to the presentation given by Marta Janczewska. The title of this presentation is The Ringelblum Archive as a Global Text. I have to say that Marta Janczewska, she is one of the leading historian in our institute. By profession, he is the historian of literature and historian of the Polish culture, but she's working extensively just on the Ringelblum Archive. And last time was published her anthology with Jacek Leociak, anthology of the composed from the different parts of the Ringelblum Archive. She also prepared a lot of articles, a lot of commentaries, and now she's working with others, but she's a leader of the group on the so-called Encyclopedia of the Warsaw Ghetto. This encyclopedia will be published in internet on our web page, and I expect that it will be a great event when the document this text will be published. So now we have 20-minute lecture of Marta Janczewska. Please go on.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. Our topic today is the Ringelblum Archive, and I would like to show you some documents from the Ringelblum Archive in my presentation. This is a selection of sample documents. I wish they were here, so please pay attention to the degree of destruction, the languages in which they are written, etc. The materiality and the physical appearance of these documents is very important. So that's why they are here. They are not directly related to my speech, so they will run in a loop. So much for the beginning, and let's start. The Ringelblum Archive as a global text. The history of the origin, hiding, and post-war discovery of the collection of texts known as the Underground Archive of the Warsaw Ghetto, Podziemne Archiwum Getta Warszawskiego, that is the Ringelblum Archive, Archiwum Ringelbluma, RRG, is a unique page in the history of World War II in general, and particularly in the history of the documentation of Nazi crimes. It is safe to say that an individual dealing with the history of the Holocaust on Polish territories cannot omit the text from this unique archive. In all their diversity in terms of the genre and topic, they constitute a fundamental material for Holocaust research. Let us remember that the ERG originates from Emanuel Ringelblum's private notes, kept since early September 1939. Just a few months later, Ringelblum realized his idea to document all Nazi crimes committed on the Jews on the occupied territories of Poland. To this end, he put together a team of co-workers who were to collect all possible documents connected with the extermination. In autumn 1940, the Onek Shabbat group, the ARG's code name, began to collect official documents, record interviews with Jewish refugees and displaced Jews, and commission analysis and studies on issues connected with this topic. Its activity gathered particular momentum after the closure of the ghetto, so for obvious reason, it remained clandestine until the end. During the Great Liquidation campaign, the archive materials were secured in a hurry. the first part on the night of the 3rd August 1942 in the cellar of the school building at Nowolipki Street 68, and the second one probably in February 1943 in the same place. In reference to the Ringelblum Archive, the epithet global used in the title suggests that the archive can be read as a complete and integral text. Consequently, it is not only a collection of over 2,000 individual, sometimes incidental texts, varied in terms of their topic and length, as well as linguistically and graphically. It can also be described as one integral and coherent text about one topic: the death of the Jewish community in Poland under the German occupation, presented through various parts and from various perspectives. Such a treatment of the ARG seems justified for 3 reasons. First of all, the individual documents which make up the archive have the same origin, regardless of where they were produced or under what circumstances. In the end, they all went through the hand of Ringelblum and his closest co-workers. Consequently, the documents' close kinship was established by their shared genealogy, constructed by Onek Shabbat's decision to include them in the archive. Secondly, the one integral ARG text was glued by the external factors, time, water, and dirt, which in the cellar of the building at Nowolipki Street 68 turned the individual documents into literally one document, whose pages managed to be separated only with great effort. This homogeneity of the documents exists, so to speak, on the genetic level. Thirdly, due to the habit which makes modern scholars talk about the Ringelblum Archive, that is, treat this collection as a whole, which does not preclude quoting or referring to specific documents, as a separate phenomenon incomparable to any other of this type, which owes its importance partly to the fact that it cannot be reduced to any of its parts. So, what type of text would the global text of the Ringelblum Archive be? The form in which the ERG materials were collected, that is, a collection of individual documents of a very diverse character, automatically calls up association with the silvarerum genre in its basic meaning. Silvarerum, Latin forest of things, a form of writing very characteristic of Polish territories. Indeed, the form of the ERG text has a number of elements characteristic of the silvarerum genre. First of all, a reader of the ERG must have connotation with the notion of variety, so characteristic of silvarerum, present here in many dimensions. The first reading allows one to become immersed in this textual forest, to which conducive is the multitude of documents and their diversity. Let us remember that the ERG text is extremely extensive. The first part consists of over 20,000 sheets, and the second one of almost 8,000. A separate issue is the presence of quotation from reality in the literary meaning of this word. These are objects which were a part of the everyday life during the Holocaust. A signboard of a small shop in the ghetto, a public transport ticket from occupied Warsaw, or a wrapping of a sweet produced in the Warsaw ghetto. The documents are written in several languages, predominantly in Yiddish, Polish, and Hebrew, 3 languages spoken by Polish Jews, and in German, of course, and occasionally we have text in any other languages. The next extremely characteristic feature of the archive is its internal genealogical diversity. It can be regarded as a completely extraordinary melange of genres and discourses. High genres mingle with the low ones, a prayer with lyrics of satirical songs. The multitude of genres and discourses is inseparably connected with the multitude of topics, particularly those regarding the everyday life during the Holocaust, hunger, disease, repressions, and also the possibilities of making a profit, entertainment, studying, and resting. The ARG documents illustrated first and foremost the Holocaust seen through the eyes of its victims, the Jews, but next to them are also documents presenting the Polish point of view, for instance, testimony Polacy o Żydach, Poles on Jews, and German documents. Therefore, this finite collection of documents, which have been assigned specific file numbers, refers indirectly to all the others lost texts that testify to the Holocaust, burned, buried under the ruins, or hidden and never discovered. This issue is best illustrated by the legendary third part of the ARG, which has never been found. Could the text, consisting of thousands of documents so formally and stylistically varied, be ordered according to a certain principle? It seems that the term that can best describe the ERG's organizing principle is the Poetics of Quotation. The quotation becomes its constitutive characteristic. It constitutes the ARG text on a number of different levels. First and foremost, the entire archive is based on what somebody said. Not only because the ARG consists to a large extent of diaries, memoirs, testimonies, or questionnaires and the like, which naturally present what the Holocaust witnesses said, but also because the words of witness are present at the heart of the documents of a different character. The studies, that is synthesizing text, reports and sketches. This orientation towards what somebody said testifies to the authorial strategy, which consists in collecting individual voices, perspectives, opinion, and experiences. So it is no wonder that obtainment of testimonies from individuals had an important place in Onek Shabbat's activity. It was Ringelblum's ambition to have several people comment on every topic, which was to ensure objectivity and comprehensiveness and make it easier for future historians and, of course, prosecutors to extract objective truths. The Dictionary of Literary Terms does not list the term testimony as a separate entry in the field of literary theory. But this doesn't mean that testimony, or actually witness testimony, is not a separate literary genre. So it was known even earlier. It was probably first used by Onek Shabbat with such consistency and intent and on such a scale, earning great popularity during the post-war period. By its nature, the testimony seems a product of wars, massacres, and crimes, and it originates halfway between clerical practice on the one hand and the individual, personal, and unique experience on the other hand. Whatever the testament of men tried predominantly by a totalitarian regime constitutes a momentous issue, the testimony is used in a way enabling the victim to verbalize his experiences so that they can be used as evidence, usually during a court trial, but also in sociological, historical, and other studies. The essence of the testimony is the clash of two subjects. The reporting one, who shares his emotions and experiences, and the recording one, who is to record the testimony as faithfully as possible, at the same time subjecting it to the rules of the written text, thus inadvertently becoming a co-author of the final message. This is what is happening with the ARG. The ARG was the first one to use such a form of testimony, a verbal statement of an individual recorded by a third person. Let us remember that the testimonies in the ARG are products of conversations, interviews with Warsaw ghetto residents, usually refugees or people resettled from various localities, who told the Onek Shabbat co-workers about their experiences since September 1939. During the conversation, the Onek Shabbat recorder wrote down the witness's statement using abbreviation. After the interview, he edited it by expanding his notes. In the end, after writing the full version of the testimony, it was copied, often several times, either by the recorder or another person. So, as you see, this is really first-person story. Let us recall that those who testify come from the occupied territories of almost all of Poland, rooting their experience in the local context. They show that the Holocaust took place here, in their towns and villages. Let us remind you that the ARG has preserved reports of the Jewish fate in dozens of Polish cities under German occupation. The modern thinking of Ringelblum and his group has resulted in a number of works on, among others, the role of women in everyday life under occupation, analysis of the relation between local Poles and Jews, forms of Jewish collaboration, etc. They show the deaths of Jewish victims, which take place not only in gas chamber, but first of all in the streets of cities and towns in Central and Eastern Europe, due to hunger and disease and the entire anti-Jewish policy. They show that the Holocaust took place in front of Polish neighbors and often with their participation. They do so without ever losing sight of an individual victim biography which speaks of his unique suffering. Further developing of metaphor of the silver rerum as a thick forest, one might say that the textual trees are built from tree rings, building up atop of one another, with the voice of the original witness talking about the events that affected him directly located at the center of every document. These words are carried further, repeated by person after person, and then recorded by one of the Onek Shabbat co-workers or by the witness himself and submitted to the archives. The Poetics of Quotation, which build the ARG text, give the whole text a metatextual character. It is a text about text, and there are ways of speaking or writing about the Holocaust. But juxtaposing highly diverse discourses and topics, always fragmentary and incomplete, but emphasizing the individual lot and point of view, the ARG becomes a presentation of how to speak or write about the Holocaust. It gives a very practical answer to the question of how it should be done, by quoting witnesses testifying about the Holocaust. Moreover, it shows the Holocaust as an event deeply rooted in the local context, in local languages, in the local geographical context, and in the experience of a specific man with his or her unique biography. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Now it is time for Katarzyna Person for her 20 minutes talk. Katarzyna Person is a professor of history working at Jewish Historical Institute. She published in last few years two very important books. One is called Policeman. It's a book on the Jewish policeman in Warsaw Ghetto. And second book, it is about the displaced person in Germany after the Second World War. Now she got the scholarship from the Munich University, and now she's living in Germany for a few months. Hope she will return in September to Poland, of course. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you for having me and for giving me the opportunity to speak about my topic today. I will be talking today about gender-specific violence as portrayed in the Ringelblum Archive, and in particular about one aspect of this violence. That's the first disclaimer, and the second one is that I'll be speaking about violence against women. This, of course, not to say that there was no violence against men and no sexual violence against men in the Warsaw Ghetto. There's now ample scholarship by, among others, Dorota Głowacka, showing that such violence was also existing in the Holocaust, was also existing in the ghettos, and is also portrayed in the Ringelblum Archive to a small degree, but nonetheless it does exist there. But for the sake of my paper today, I'll be looking at violence against women, so looking at women as victims and men as perpetrators, of course taking fully into consideration that this is not the only violence, not the only sexual violence and gender-specific violence taking place in the ghetto, not the only one which is portrayed in the Ringelblum Archive. So what I want to do really today is to look at how this incredibly interesting and incredibly complex collection of documents, which is the Underground Archive of the Warsaw Ghetto, and the collection which really aims at looking at all aspects of life in the ghetto and all aspects of life which were considered taboo before the war as well, and which were considered taboo during and after the war, and which really is extremely empathetic when it comes to topics like that, and very sensitive, looks at this particular case. So how it looks at the case of violence, especially sexual violence against women, also taking into consideration that's an important part, an important aspect of this archive, is that it was staffed by women to a large degree. There was a lot, maybe not large, but there was a number of female collaborators working with the archive, and their voices relating to violence against women, as I'll show you in a moment, were also preserved. So let's just start by saying that there is now, as I said, a lot of scholarship showing that Jewish women in Warsaw were indeed, from the very first day of the occupation, subjected to various types of sexual-related violence or assaults and humiliation, and that happened before the closure of the ghetto, in the ghetto itself, and later on, after deportations, it affected also women in hiding. This is also very clearly portrayed in documents from the Ringelblum Archive, which speak about it quite openly. It describes assaults which take place during searches and looting of houses, during personal examinations, during roundups for forced labor, during the forced labor itself, and then during deportations and afterwards. It's of course important also to remember that this violence, the sexual aspect of it, or the aspect of sexual gratification, is only one part of it. There is also, of course, the issue of humiliation, of showing power, manifesting power, and also an important aspect of anti-Semitic motivation. So all of them together come together in those events, which are described, as I said, in Ringelblum Archive. While these cases are openly discussed, I want to look at one particular case, and one that I think is particularly difficult and particularly interesting when we look at documents from the archive, and that is that of forced prostitution or prostitution in the ghettos of women who work as prostitutes. This topic appears in the archive, and I think, and I'd like to show it, is one of the important topics on the basis of which authors from the archive discuss the Jewish community moral standing, and it becomes a sort of a compass of the moral condition of the Jewish community in the ghetto. And I won't be talking here, though this is another very interesting aspect and very important case, of course, is that of women who work as prostitutes already before the closure of the ghetto, and then continue to do so once the ghetto is closed. They, as we can assume, form the majority of women who worked as prostitutes, or clear majority of women who worked as prostitutes in the ghetto, yet also because they were usually impoverished, because they were usually outside conventional family structures, and which later became a network of support in the ghetto. They were also the ones to quite easily succumb to illnesses, to hunger, and often die before even deportations. The women which I'll be talking about are women who are beginning to work as prostitutes once the ghetto is closed, or later on in 1942, late 1941. So women often coming from, women, girls really, as we would say today, coming from middle class backgrounds, who for one reason or another become the key breadwinners in their family networks or in their surroundings. This is mainly and very often because of the absence of a male earner. For example, it could be a father or a husband who goes to the east and doesn't come back and doesn't live in the ghetto with them. He could be during forced labor. He could be otherwise unable to work, and they have to take on the responsibility of looking after the families. So these are the women which I'll be talking about. Emanuel Ringelblum in his notes writes about a wave of, and I'm putting quote unquote, respectable women which are now standing on ghetto streets and working as prostitutes. But it seems that the majority of them, and there's also quite interesting other memoirs on the topic, among others by Janczewska, get into prostitution or working as prostitutes through working in bars and cafes where they work as waitresses, and for some of them, additional duties are also linked to prostitution. Surprisingly, well, not surprisingly at all, unsurprisingly, the majority of people who work for the Ringelblum Archive, write for Ringelblum Archive, openly condone women who make a living that way. What is, I think, surprising, maybe for us today, is that among those who openly condone women working as prostitutes are also those people who we would associate today with a particularly empathetic look at life at the ghetto. So people like Emanuel Ringelblum himself, or Abraham Levin, or Stanisław Różycki. So people who provide us with very empathetic, very complex, very sensitive look at changes happening in the ghetto and everyday life in the ghetto. So, for example, Stanisław Różycki writes, when writing about women who are in cafes, writes about them as round, ugly, made up with deep necklines, completely drunk nymphomaniacs, which wouldn't be surprising maybe had it not been part of probably one of the most sensitive studies of life in the ghetto, which is his study of cafes, which is a very complex essay in which he looks at different establishments set up in the ghetto, in which he tries to discuss why they were set up, who frequented them, why people would seek escapism in cafes. So this is a really beautiful and one of my favorite essays from the Warsaw Ghetto, I think. And yet, in the middle of this complex and sensitive and very modern take on demographic changes happening in the ghetto, we have this mention of drunk nymphomaniacs. The same with Levin, whose diary is again one of the most beautiful, I think, depictions of ghetto life, one of the most sensitive ones. And yet he also is openly critical without trying to understand why this woman would have to make a living that way. Emanuel Ringelblum, another case, probably the best known, the most infamous, of course, is his discussion of not only prostitution itself, but also things which, by all means, would be today discussed as sexual violence. He writes about women who are on the Umschlagplatz and who agree to have sexual relations with Jewish policemen because they hope that this way they can get out of the Umschlagplatz and save their lives or save lives of the families. And Ringelblum, in his notes, writes that he believes that a tribunal should be set up for these women as much as for the policemen after the war. So this is one case, and one that we would probably expect. But the other one is a number of writers who ascribe more to the notion of prostitution as sexual violence. So survival prostitution, or what we would discuss as forced prostitution. This notion would entail thinking that because Holocaust victims force or barter sex for survival, because otherwise they would have died, it can constitute a form of violence. This view could be together, and it is actually today, often viewed as simplistic by scholars of sexual violence, who see it as not giving enough attention to victims' agency. For example, this would follow Zoe Waxman's very right claim that refusing to acknowledge that even women in extremity can be capable of making choices renders the women involved faceless victims. So we are, I think, today closer to the view of Anka Hajkova, for example, and others who see prostitution as a rational relationship, asymmetrical yet rational, which is her term, and intimacy as just another commodity that can be traded in the ghetto. What I would claim, however, is that even though those alphas, who I'll speak about in a moment, do see forced prostitution or prostitution as violence, they at the same time don't make those women faceless. They don't turn them into faceless victims. On the contrary, those women have faces, they have names, they have agency, and they retain their agency, as I will show, even in the extremely difficult situation they found themselves in, and even when being victims of violence. And there are two key documents which mention prostitution, which are preserved in the archive. The first one is probably a bit less known. It's written by a man, by Shmuel Scheinkinder, who's a pre-war footballer, but also a sports writer and one of the key collaborators of Ringelblum Archive. Maybe not one of the key, but an important collaborator of Ringelblum Archive. And Scheinkinder wrote an essay entitled "Four Girls," which was written just before deportations in December of 1942. And in this essay, he describes walking down the street of the ghetto and coming across four girls who he knows from before the war. I mean, he recognizes them as girls from his neighborhood, from his apartment building. The names are Ala, Bella, Guta, and Zula. And they are at that point young teenagers, and he soon realizes that they also work as prostitutes because they proposition him. And he's, of course, taken aback, but then he decides to pay one of them. He takes her to his apartment, sits her down, and asks her why she's doing what she's doing. And it's really nice self-reflective moment. He's writing that he's expecting her, what he's expecting her to do, and what his view of motivations of women who work like this, of girls in this case, are. And he writes that he's expecting her to burst into tears, and he's expecting her to explain that this is the only way she can support her family. And instead of doing it, she asks him for a cigarette. And Scheinkinder, is what he takes out of it, and I'll speak about in a moment, is that sex for sale in the ghetto is no longer at this point shameful. The second document which I'd like to speak about comes from a woman, Cecilia Ślepak, and is part of a fascinating essay or study depicting the fate of women in the ghetto. It's a very well-known study. It was published in English actually already in the first volume of our English edition of Ringelblum Archive. And it's definitely one of the key documents relating to life of women in the Warsaw ghetto. And it's basically a study of a number of women who Ślepak interviews and then writes essays about them, about how their life evolves and changes in ghetto reality. And one of them is called Guta. And Guta is 20 years old on the outbreak of the war, so she's quite young. She's newly married. Her husband goes to the east and doesn't come back. And she has to start supporting her parents who own a restaurant. And in order to support them, she starts trading in gold. And as part of the business, she begins an affair with Volksdeutsch, who helps her out. And this is clearly what we would see as barter, because even the author of the essay writes openly that this relationship is based on Guta's part on cold calculation. And indeed it works out. She's successful in her business, and she's successful thanks to his help. However, then the ghetto closes, And this affair dies out, but Buchach continues similar work and similar types of work. So she trades, and she also becomes a smuggler. And throughout her career in trade, she keeps having affair with men who are powerful in that field, and because of that, she manages to succeed. And she's doing it openly. That's another important part of this essay. She's not ashamed of what she's doing, but at least she doesn't try to hide what she's doing. However, then smuggling becomes more and more difficult and more dangerous, and Guta gets a job as a waitress, and then later on begins working as a prostitute. And this is through that she's supporting her family, and as Cecilia Schlepek writes, and I quote, "Selling her body, she has a chance of economic survival together with her family." And what is really interesting about those essays, I think, other than the fact that those women have names and have faces, which is an important part of the archive altogether, and a characteristic of the archive, the fact of giving names and giving faces to people who would otherwise remain nameless, is the fact that both authors undoubtedly stigmatize the protagonists of the story. There's no doubt about it, but they stigmatize them for trying not to conceal what they're doing. And Schenkin actually writes openly that unlike the women who do it quote unquote quietly, who get themselves rich lovers, those girls, and I quote, don't even try to attempt to make an effort to make a living differently. They are a destructive element in the ghetto life. However, they don't, and I think neither of them does really, stigmatize them for what they're actually doing. They portray them, they even like them, I think. I think both authors actually write the women they write about, or the girls they write about. They show them as bold, as brave, as resourceful, and above all, as the only source of support for families which they support. And this portrayal, I think, becomes especially interesting if we contrast it with what happens after the war. And there's, of course, now a lot written about the silence regarding women's experience, not only the Holocaust, but women's experience in the war in general, not in the immediate, but in the post-war period altogether. But in this case, I would like to look at, in particular, documents from the archive which are published after the war. Those two texts were not published for, I think, obvious reason, but other documents which do mention sexual violence against women, including Ringelblum's notes, were published and were heavily censored. They were censored in two ways. To put it very briefly, on one hand, they were censored by the outside censorship, but also internal censorship of the publishers in expectations of the outside censorship, and that is in order to make it in line with the current historical politics. And on the other hand, they were censored by the internal censorship. So by the internal censorship, I mean the censorship in the publishing house, and also the one of the editors who were attempting to safeguard the image and of the Holocaust and the virtue, we may say, of victims of the Holocaust, and the appropriate memory of the Holocaust that should be preserved. And that also included violence against women. And I will look at one case and very briefly talk about one case of a novel which is preserved in the Ringelblum Archive, and that comes from an article which I wrote recently together with Agnieszka Żółkiewska from the Jewish Historical Institute. And that's a case of Zalmanskau's Swastika, which is a novel preserved in the archive, quite sensationalist, with some sexual scenes as well involved in it, most of them cut out. And but not only those, there's also scenes of violence, sexual violence against women, which are cut out. For example, one of the main protagonists, Ada Berman, is caught in a roundup on a street and then subjected to abuse, among sexual abuse as well, and she's also raped. And this event is openly discussed and openly described in this novel preserved in the Ringelblum Archive, yet it was cut out in 1954. But this is not only Jewish women, there are also Polish women in the book. One of them, called Wanda, is a maid who stays in the ghetto because she wants to stay together with her Jewish employers. And she's, all in all, a very positive character, though she is also shown as sensual and sexually promiscuous. And interestingly, maybe not interestingly, but the census cut out everything that has anything to do with her sensuality. But they also cut out a case of sexual violence which she's subjected to when she's deported from Poland. And I'll just quote from the book, from the manuscript preserved in the Ringelblum Archive, in which they speak of Wanda being deported to a great unknown city with cloisters and chimneys, with speeding trains and trams. Somewhere there, to a small establishment located in a narrow lane, come officers from torpedo boats and submarines. They gather there during their leave to carry out orgies with young Poles who have to give them their bodies on demand. So Wanda is basically deported to a brothel in Hamburg. In the first publication of the book, the 1954 publication, this brothel in Hamburg is turned into a German forced labor camp. So I think this just this short comparison shows you very clearly the uniqueness of Ringelblum Archive. Also the willingness of its collaborators to look at topics which I think they are clearly outside that pre-war frame of reference. Topics which they clearly find often uncomfortable to discuss. And they're often not able, as we can see, to overcome the stigmatization of women who work as prostitutes, the stigmatization of sexual barter. They're also often not able to overcome the stigmatizations of victims of sexual violence. Yet I think the fact that they do speak about it, that they do especially attempt to show various stages of coercion, which is involved in prostitution in the ghetto, undoubtedly helps us today to look at the victim's perspective, also of those victims. Those documents show us women who have to survive in extremely difficult conditions, conditions which challenge the existing constructs of masculinity and femininity, and who also have to contribute to survival of others. And I think it shows in a fascinating way the way in which the stories are told and retold by different people, and how the stigma of these events is challenged, but is also kept both during and after the persecution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Professor. I've forgotten about one thing, speaking about the Katarzyna person. She's the key editor-in-chief of the Ringelblum Archive in our institute, in Jewish Historical Institute, and thanks to her were edited a lot of volumes of Polish of Archive of Ringelblum, and now she's in charge of the group of the team who is working on English translation of the Ringelblum Archive. I'm very grateful to her for this kind of the work. And now it's time for the commentaries. And first commentary I expect will be given by Audrey Kichlewski. I need to read her bio. Please give me a moment. I will open the file. Audrey Kichlewski, she's living, I understand, in Paris, is an associate professor of the contemporary history in Strasbourg, member of research group on Central Europe, and junior fellow of Institut Universitaire de France. Her book entitled Survivors, Jews in Poland Since the Holocaust, published in France, will be soon published in Polish in the Jewish Historical Institute Publishing House. She also co-edited the volume Le Polonais et la Shoah, une nouvelle école historique. And now it's time, please, floor is open. Please, you have 10 minutes, even 12 minutes to present your commentaries.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation and the invitation to comment on those presentation. And first thing I want to say about the presentation that we have just listened to is the way they highlight very well the importance of those first-hand documents of the Holocaust coming from the victims themselves, and how they have such a valuable character in many respects. Some of them hitherto put aside or a little bit neglected in the whole writing of the history of the Holocaust, in the historiography and the whole body of scholarship about the Holocaust. My first point is obviously, well, is the most obvious, is of course their documentary aspect. It's obvious, but I have to state again how was shown by Marta Janczewska that the Ringelblum Archive, but also could be said about quite similar enterprises of wartime documentation coming from the victims, how this archive became a very unique source to grasp a glimpse about the fate of Polish Jewry during the Second World War. And to be sure, and it has been well shown, this archive had been created by the members of Onek Shabbat for this particular purpose. And it has long been used by a generation of scholars for the richness of information it contains on very various different aspects. But yet, we know that after an initial period in the aftermath of the war, when the issue of gathering and publishing documents was a very crucial mission for survivors and their families, and this all over Europe, not only Poland, of course. Every trace, photographs, testimonies, memoir, drawings, documents of all kind, all those traces, we know that they were quite soon in part marginalized, taken into account for writing the first books, historical books on the war and on the Holocaust, while attention shifted to perpetrators' documentation. And we know that for various reasons, the context of the post-war trials, where the evidence of the crime was what was searched after, and those official more abandoned, despite the attempts of the perpetrator to destroy the proofs of their crimes. Those documents coming from the perpetrators were deemed more relevant to write the history of the destruction of the European Jews, at least in the 1950s and 60s. Fortunately, the past 2 decades, at least, writing of the Holocaust have turned back to writing in a much more integrated history, to take the word from Saul Friedlander's approach and his masterpiece, the Nazi Germany and the Jews, showing how central the voice of the victims were in order to fully understand the mechanism of the social interaction from below, and not use as anecdotal quotation to illustrate the consequences of the Nazis' plans of massive violence inflicted on idle victims. And the keynote lecture we had in the beginning of the afternoon by Omer Bartov and his monography on Buchach really encapsulate this trend, giving at last the well-deserved place to these first-hand documents. But a second aspect raised by the presentation, and especially here from Marta Janczewska, is the fruitful reflection on the materiality of the documents themselves as a testimony of the past. The tiny pieces of paper on which notes were written, drafts, but also the tram tickets, the food coupons, the private photographs are in themselves to be analyzed as a forest of signs. The expression Sylvia Reum, forest of things, are also signs of traces of what is no more. And taking into consideration this materiality is, I think, very crucial, because only by this action can another way of writing the history of the Holocaust, a different way, informed and even transformed in its narrative by the sources. And I am following here, for instance, what was stated by historian Tim Cole in his book Traces of the Holocaust, writing in a way maybe less linear narrative, and a focus, as it was also said before earlier in the afternoon, a focus on micro-histories that can be as telling as history with big numbers and bigger issues, and at last writing Holocaust history with a real concern for the victims and for their voices that can in this way be heard. And my third point, and I'm coming to my point, which was also highlighted in the papers, but now more specifically in Katarzyna Person's reflection on the way that the women who found themselves in the prostitution in the Warsaw Ghetto are described by several authors within the Ringelblum Archive. The importance again to find back their voices, even if they did not testify themselves, or even if their voices were censored, altered, or silenced, and her very careful reading that she did of those texts can help us better understand their actions and their agency, as it was well shown, and only in this way can again they be properly remembered. But yet, and I will come to a conclusion of my comments and maybe open up with a suggestion or open question, yet as it was also pointed by the presented, contextualization is of course indispensable to understand the documents available. If they are not put in the proper historical context, how can you understand the documents from the Ringelblum Archives, what they are, where do they come from, what a photograph can mean? Is always well, the mission of the historian, that to contextualize those first-hand documents. So my last comment leading to my open question would relate to the post-war fate and reading of those documents, and their very polyphonic and palimpsest character of this wartime documentation. Seems to me that it somehow continues in the immediate aftermath, at least. See, for instance, the questionnaires, the answers to the questionnaires gathered by the Jewish Historical Commission in Poland by thousands of survivors, the answers formulated by thousands of survivors, and those documents, those post-war documents, are also, in their respect, very pluralistic in the way that they mix the voices of the survivors themselves with those of their relatives who did not survive, who are always mentioned, named, portrayed, and again, and also the rewriting, rephrasing by the many individuals that were charged to transcribe the oral interviews. And those are also kind of different layers to analyze of as posters of what could be said or not at that time. And even countries like France, where there was not a systematic policy from survivors to document, to gather documents from the victim. The Centre de Documentation Juive Contemporaine, which was created during the war, aimed primarily at collecting documents from the perpetrators. Yet, its journal issued very early after the war publication of wartime documentation and from and of testimony, and those have shown a very pluralistic, again, voices of the Holocaust, and they really embody same kind of documentary style from the victim perspective. But also with some silence, some censorship, despite a very different political situation than Poland was experiencing at the same time. They were silenced. There were things that could not be published after the war in the journal among French survivors. So my question would be that. Couldn't the post-war fates of those documents be analyzed in a more transnational or international vision, when I'm so struck by similarities between despite the political situation very different from one country to another in Europe, where survivors found themselves, thus making the issue of the intern or self-censorship according to the moral standards or expected behaviors victims should have had a more relevant explanatory tool to understand also why it would become for years very difficult to read through and grasp the scope of this documentation. So I hope my question is clear, and I thank you for your attention on this short comment.
Thank you, Audrey. Now it is time for the commentary from Roma Sandyka. Roma Sandyka is a professor of Krakow University and is working in the Department of Anthropology of Literature and Cultural Studies in the Faculty of the Polish Studies. She is also the co-founder and director of the Research Center for the Memory Cultures, co-founder and collaborator in the curatorial group, the Curatorial Collective. Roma Sandyka, she's working on the cultural theory, visual culture studies, and on non-sites of memory. And she's leading a team of postdoctoral scholars working on a research project on uncommemorated genocide sites and their impact on collective memory, cultural identity, ethical attitudes, and intercultural relations in contemporary Poland. Yes, the floor is open. Please present your comments.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm really pleased to be part of this event, and I hope to contribute to this discussion from a different angle. So, as it was mentioned, I'm a literary scholar by training and memory scholar by practice, and both of the presentations were strongly directed toward the textual character of Ringelblum Archive. So my questions and my thinking will be mostly methodological, how to work, how to approach, how to respond to the textual layer of what we receive as an archival document. However, also the fact that these objects are multimedia is also interesting to me, and I would like to pose some questions. So we were asked to work on Ringelblum Archive, and this is the point of departure for our thinking tonight. And it has this dramatic history, complex structure that Marta Janczewska so aptly familiarized us with it. It has also very diverse interpretations that include today critical editions. I mean, for instance, that one that was mentioned by Professor Śpiewak. So an edition in a famous or even fundamental series published in Poland called National Library, presenting texts by grand literary practitioners like Mickiewicz or Leśmian. So in this series recently, Ringelblum Archive was presented. So in a way, presented as a literary text. It has also different other responses fashioned in the language of film and exhibition. And this, I think, allows us to ask broader questions on the ontology of the archive and, of course, the epistemology of work with archival sources. And I'm well aware that these questions have been asked so many times until now, but recoding of scale from global to the local proposed to us as an intellectual task of this conference and especially of this session, since we had this wonderful introduction by Omer Bartov. This allows, I think, to pose these questions anew and from another angle, how to return to archives with this objective to look for the indigenous, for the local, for the topical, how to work with data, often awkwardly categorized, stashed in boxes labeled varia. An archival record, of course, is not a self-evident piece of evidence waiting its rediscovery, but it is a document full of nuance, depth, breadth, and in need of its interpreter, of course. So how to uncover what was tabooed and hashed down? I think Katarzyna Persson gave us an informed example. How to respond to objects of non-textual character. András Lénárt presented an example of such an approach. This presentation was available online. In other words, what tools do we need to dissect grand historical narratives when working in and with the archives of Holocaust records to reach the inner layer of possibly still bleeding tissues, to look through a magnifying glass and with this new myopic gaze to understand the anatomy of genocide. The presentations display the shared effort to call for solid methods to read archival documents when they depart from the typical format of a genre of administrative record, formatted, expressed in writing, produced with the intention of intelligibility. What came to my mind is the book by anthropologist and historian Anne Laura Stoller in her Along the Archival Grain, Epistemic Anxieties and Colonial Common Sense from a decade ago. She was advocating dynamic processual reading of archives, and she stressed that archives can be read along or against the grain. Reading along the grain, we might discover the molten relationships between institutions, power systems, personal lives. Reading against the grain, we might unravel the internal logic of records and identify hidden data embedded in them. Both strategies can, of course, grant access to the local, to the regional, to grassroots dimensions of violence. So Marta Janczewska shows how to respond, I think, to the hierarchical logic of archival silva rerum, so the forest of things, how to develop this inclusive and democratic approach to very diverse languages, media, formats, and genres, embracing the economy of fragment and quotation that was so fundamental for establishing the Ringelblum Archive. So this epistemic inclusivity leads to, I think, to the hierarchization that reveals finally not only the globality of this text, but also something that is of great interest to me. So this grassroots relations, affects, communications, and this brings forward distinctive uniqueness of localized Holocaust experience of victims. I wonder what strategy is needed when the scholar is exposed to this multitude of formats and languages and assumes, in a way, the task of translator, forcing the uncoordinated plurality into one coherent monolingual text. So how it is possible to communicate the diversity of Holocaust archive when approaches, so what approaches proved to be most productive so far for Ringelblum Archive for its presentation. So Katarzyna person reads texts explicitly presenting women's resilience in adhering to different means, securing survival, but she also shows how to rescue data omitted, censored, silenced, or embedded into a frame of hostile comments. So another fundamental methodological question is then how to, according to her experience, retrieve data from empty or almost empty files regarding those who were not considered primary historical subjects and on events that were felt unacceptable in historical narrative. So possibly an entire repertoire of Aesopian encryption. So I think antonomasia, aposiopesis, metaphor, periphrases is harnessed here to communicate a message about the past that escapes the attention of those who read text along the grain. If András, Lénárt, or Luiza Nader would be with us, I would gladly ask how to perform historical analysis of hybrid visual textual objects. Ringelblum Archive holds posters, photographs, advertising prints. We saw so many examples in the presentation of Marta Janczewska. So since the early 1990s, these will be my final comments, enormous numbers of inaccessible documents, earlier inaccessible documents, have become available in archives freed from communist control and censorship. This is a quotation from Omer Bartov. And he advocated in this essay that Professor Śpiewak already mentioned, I also consider it groundbreaking and extremely important for scholars from beyond Iron Curtain. Eastern Europe as a site of genocide. Bartov advocated return to Eastern European rich archives and called for this new scrutiny of their content. He stressed the need to work with data, so to get, quote, intimate knowledge of the regions, unquote, and to arrive at the, quotation again, contextualization of genocide within the social media of the victims, unquote. So this is crucial as we heard today, and as he presented in his powerful meditation on the life and death of Buchach. It allows, I think, this approach to grasp specific, uncommon local conditioning of violence, and this call echoes today more and more forcefully, I think, among also new generations of scholars. I think about Max Bergholz's meticulous study on Kulen Vaków in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and he writes in the conclusion of this book, I quote, conducting a local history does not simply provide us a view from below, which can complement a history from above and provide a more complete but fundamentally unchanged historical portrait from what historians already claim to know. Rather, the local perspective provides us with critical means through which to question a central assumption at the heart of so many studies of this part of the world, that ethnicity is deeply rooted and central category of practice, and thus a central axis of conflict. So history of the Holocaust, as Omer Bartov stated, cannot be written without knowledge of the cultures, languages, traditions, politics of the people that was murdered, or of the peoples in which midst the killing took place, or in the lands in which the majority of the victims had resided, unquote. This new projected new multifaceted reading of Eastern European archives, embedding research into local languages, cultures, mental contexts, grant access to this much needed fuller non-reductive knowledge, but also offers, I'm now following the observation mentioned by Berkholz, and now quote, a way to move forward past an ongoing impasse that profoundly shapes scholarship, politics, and everyday life in many parts of the world, that continued prevalence of ethnic categories in daily practice and the general inability to formulate new categories of historical analysis. So what's at stake? And what I would like to stress, concluding what I have to say, is the history from below, that looking at the archives as specific localized texts can not only supplement that what you already know, but simply restructure the very ground historical approach, the methods and ways we try to understand past, still reflecting on our contemporary time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 15 minutes more. It's a lot of time, I understand. And I need also to mention that part of our conference is a video presented by András Lénárt from the Holocaust Museum Memorial Center in Budapest. The video presentation is available on the website of the conference. If you want to speak about this video and you need, I think that we could of course speak about it, but I'm not sure whether András Lénárt is taking part in our conference. But in any case, it is the moment when Marta Janczewska and Katarzyna person could answer the problems, answer the question put by Andrzej Kichlewski and by Roma Sentyka. We have to speak in English, unfortunately, in spite of in Polish, but we have to. Pani Marto.
Well, thank you very much for such inspiring remarks and comments. I treat the comments as a material for further thinking, first of all. So they are so multi-directional and I am a little bit overwhelming. But first, I must add something fundamental. Because I use the conception of silver rerum, and I must stress that, of course you get it, but I must stress it, that I use it only in a metaphorical sense, because of course it's clear and no doubt that the ERG is rooted in Jewish tradition, first of all. It is clear, no doubt that ERG can be represented in the Urbanforschung tradition, which is Jewish tradition, and Jewish historians like Dubnow, Chernikover were involved in collecting the testimonies after pogroms 1914, 1921, as I remember good. And Onek Szabatis is rooted in social research from European research in 1920s years, studies on the history of the Jewish parish in this time in Poland. In 1925, the Jewish Scientific Institute is established in Vilna. Ringelblum used this methodology of the institute very intensive. And after the war, the traditional was taken up by the Central Jewish Historical Commission. So should be emphasized that there is there is a tradition of Jewish gathered testimonies and so on. So I am agree that this kind of text, I think I'm thinking on Ringelblum Archive, this kind of text is a new type of text for multiple fields. It's a kind of bomb who destroyed the traditional thinking of text, and we can rethinking the traditional approach to many aspects, as Roma Sendyka said. And one example, because the cardinal rule in Ringelblum Archive was copying of the text. So in the end, we have a big disproportion, because a big parts of text are destroyed. There is a lot of gaps in text. So many information are lost. But on the other hand, a lot of information are repeated in very directly in the same sentences, you can say. So there is a kind of echolalia, you can say, in this text. So I think it's very interesting. And it's also very important the thinking of materiality of this text, and I agree with Audrey that materiality is very important. This text is made also not only by people, but also by time, by water, but mold. So it's one of the factors that we can. It takes decades to put in order the text. So I think the research on this kind of documents have just started. So there is a lot to do. So thank you once again for your inspiration question. Thank you.
Okay. Katarzyna Persson, please. Now it's your time for answers.
Thank you, and thank you as well for those incredibly enlightening commentaries. When listening to them, I was thinking about silence, and because we were talking about voices and getting those voices from the archive, but I think it's just as important to look at silence, and not just the post-war silence, but also silence of the archive and what is silenced in the archive. So there's the silence which Marta spoke about. So the material silence which is imposed by destruction, by the fact that those documents are not complete, and that certain things are silenced from the outside, but also the silence which is imposed by the archivists, by the archive, by Ringelblum, by people writing about it, by those who are involved in research. And I think in what I was talking about, the silence and silencing already in the archive is very well seen. And of course, in the post-war period of the publication, and what Audrey was talking about as well, this silence is further imposed by the survivors themselves, by those who speak in their name, by those who speak in the name of those who were murdered, by those who publish those documents, and who censor them differently. And in terms of how those documents circulate around the world, I think a fascinating case study is that how those documents were censored after the war, how they were censored differently in different places, and how different communities, in different Jewish communities, even different Polish Jewish communities, or different communities of Jews from Poland, maybe better, all around the world reacted differently to those contents, and reacted differently to this censorship or not. But in terms also of what you said about those post-war documents, I think they are crucial here because of those silences which are also in the archive. I think they're crucial way of supplementing it. And I would even argue that they are a direct continuation of what the archive does. That the archive doesn't, of course, end in early 1943, that there is still continuation happening already during the war of supplementing those voices from the archive. And it's also happening after the war. And those early post-war testimonies, maybe not even early post-war, maybe all testimonies should be really seen as a continuation and supplementation of what's in the archive. Because I think, as I was trying to show and maybe didn't quite succeed, it's not necessarily that everything that is in the archive is so pure. This isn't, and I believe in quite strongly, the purest voice of the Holocaust experience we can get is the voice that's in the Ringelblum Archive. I wouldn't say so. I think that's a voice which is mediated by many other voices. It's the view of the experience of people, which is seen by a number of lenses: cultural, traditional, and then personal lenses of Ringelblum and personal lenses of those who write those stories. Yes, I think it should be supplemented by what was said and written afterwards, and in that way, those silences in the archive, which are really just as fascinating as that what is said, can be filled. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I have to say that we don't have any question from the audience. Perhaps people generally people needs more time and more, how to say, thoughts to address the question just to the authors of the presentations. It is quite possible to do it simply sending the question to our institute, and I think that every question will be carefully discussed and answered by Katarzyna Persson and Marta Janczewska. From my perspective, the very important element is that archive, to some extent, to great extent, will be in few years translated into English. It is it changed a lot in the historiography of the Holocaust, I think, and that these documents, carefully translated from Yiddish into English, from Polish into English, from Hebrew into English, that these documents will not so much change the way the Holocaust was discussed, but they could influence different kinds of the studies. I strongly believe in it, and that Katarzyna Persson and others are doing fantastic work just on presenting volume after volume of in English. It's a great job. The discussion on the archive of Ringelblum will last a long time, I think. And it's not the time to close the discussion or to open the discussion. The discussion will go on. And thank you very much for fantastic presentations, for these commentaries. And I hope that we will be able to continue this discussion on our seminars, on our, panel studies. Thank you, Professor Bartov. Thank you, András Lénárt, for his video. And I think that it is the time to close this panel and inform the people that tomorrow in the morning start session number 3. It is the session under the mysterious title, Borderline Memories in Europe, Renegotiating Holocaust Remembrance. So you are invited, all of us are invited for this conference. Please join it. And thank you once again for everyone for presentations and for the careful listening to these panels and to the presentations. Thank you very much. Goodbye.